This is part 2 of a course in the Foundations of Optimal Brain Performance, and we're looking at how to resolve everyday problems like anxiety, stress-related symptoms, sleep problems, mood problems and fatigue using the framework of functional medicine, which looks to identify underlying weak points in body systems functioning, or the specific and individual places where we can target change to make the most amount of difference. And this is the basis for creating personalized solutions and plans of action using diet and nutrition and lifestyle change. And we're going to start with a pretty fundamental theme, the body's energy production systems. Energy production at the cellular level is the basis for the experience of vitality, motivation and drive, enthusiasm and emotional positivity, and clear focus, concentration, and cognitive functioning. And conversely, when the energy production systems don't work well, we have the experience of fatigue and concomitants such as weakness, apathy or lack of motivation, low mood, and brain fog, meaning poor focus and fuzzy thinking. Actually, there are quite a few conditions for the experience of vitality and energy. And the foundation is cellular energy production, or the controlled burning of fuel from food in the presence of oxygen. But we also need a smooth and stable or reliable delivery of fuel to all the cells via the bloodstream. And of course the same applies for oxygen. We need a reliable supply again to all cells. And we need regulation of all these things, meaning that they need to be controllable. We need to be able to turn them up or down as needed. So, for example, when we're vigorously exercising, we need to turn up energy production and then turn it down again when it's time to rest or to go to sleep, for example. So in this part of the course, we'll focus on the first of these, or cellular energy production. And then later in Unit 3, we'll look at the second, or more specifically, the regulation of blood sugar. Sugar being the main source of fuel, at least for most people, most of the time. I'll touch on regulation of oxygen delivery later in this unit too, because it's an important topic, and in fact non-optimal oxygen delivery is pretty common in cases of anxiety and fatigue, etc. But we'll start with cellular energy production. All cells need to produce energy, and much of the action happens in small structures within cells called mitochondria. You can think of the mitochondria as the cell's engines. A typical cell might have a few hundred mitochondria, more if the cell needs a lot of energy, for example if it's a muscle cell. And they have this double membrane structure, and this folded inner membrane is where much of the action takes place. So they take in fuel and oxygen, and just like a car engine, there's a controlled burning of the fuel in the presence of the oxygen. That releases energy, which is captured and stored as a molecule called ATP. And ATP is then passed out of the mitochondrion so that it can be used by the cell. Now ATP actually has a pretty short life in the cell. It only lasts for a matter of seconds, or a few tens of seconds. So we need to be continually burning fuel in order to stay alive. And the process also creates waste products in the form of water and carbon dioxide. I'll say a bit more about carbon dioxide later on because it's not simply a waste product. In fact, it has an important role to play. This burning of fuel is actually a pretty complex process with a lot of steps, so I'm going to say something about the steps. Not because you really need to understand them all, but just because each step is a potential bottleneck in the process of energy production. And if any one of them goes wrong, then it's a possible cause of fatigue. And the job of the practitioner is to do the detective work of finding out where the bottleneck is. So if this seems a bit technical, please bear that in mind. I just want to illustrate the point that we need to find the weak points, or the places where we can make the most difference. So we start with the fuel from food, and the main fuel is glucose, which is a simple sugar. But most cells of the body can also burn other sources, and especially fats, but also sometimes proteins. It seems that most cells, and especially brain cells, will preferentially burn glucose, and will only burn fats and proteins when no glucose is available. And some people, it seems that they can lose that adaptive capacity to burn other fuels such as fat. And that's important if you need to lose body fat. You need to be able to switch into fat burning without feeling exhausted and without the body starting to crave more carbohydrate and sugar. I'll say a bit more about fat burning later on. So the first step is to convert these nutrient fuels into an intermediate called pyruvate. This step's called glycolysis and happens outside of the mitochondria. But then the pyruvate has got to be passed across the mitochondrial membrane. Step 2 is called the citric acid cycle, and also known as the Krebs cycle. It's actually a complex chemical reaction in itself and requires quite a few cofactors to help it along, notably some of the B vitamins, but also magnesium. Step 3 is called electron transport, and like step 2 it happens inside the mitochondrion, and it creates most of the energy, which is then captured as ATP. ATP then needs to exit the mitochondrion. When the energy that ATP is carrying is used up by the cell, ATP turns into a related molecule called ADP, and that needs to then be recycled back into the mitochondria so that it can pick up more energy, and in the process it gets turned back into ATP. So each of the three main steps releases some energy, but we see here that most of it comes from step 3. So one molecule of the sugar glucose can create potentially 36 ATPs, 32 of them from electron transport. That's at least at maximal efficiency, which is not always achieved. So it looks as though that the third step is the most important, but of course it wouldn't work without steps 1 and 2. So again, the point is that there are quite a few potential bottlenecks that can lead to the experience of fatigue. So what exactly can go wrong? Well, the first thing to mention is that if there's not enough oxygen available, cells can switch to an alternative process called anaerobic respiration, which just means energy production without oxygen. Now, it's useful if you need a big burst of energy, for example if you're sprinting, but it's very inefficient, and it produces something called lactic acid as a waste product, and that can lead to pain. Lactic acid can lead to pain if it builds up in muscles, and if it's not cleared from the system. And lactic acid can also create the experience of panic. So there's some research that shows that injecting lactic acid can induce panic. So relying on anaerobic respiration for anything more than short bursts is a bad idea. But there's some evidence that sufferers of chronic fatigue syndrome can actually get stuck in it. Next, pyruvate, which remember is this intermediate, entry of pyruvate into the mitochondrion requires acetyl L-carnitine, which is a nutrient. And if you don't have enough, then again you have a bottleneck. The next point is a very important one. The process, and especially step 3, can create molecules called free radicals. And you can think of free radicals as the exhaust fumes from the process. They're very reactive molecules, so reactive that they can do damage at the molecular level by reacting with the other molecules in the cell, such as the fats that make up the membrane of the mitochondria, or even your DNA. So they're very toxic and they need to be mopped up. And the body does that using antioxidants, which you've probably heard of. The body has lots of different antioxidants, and many of them come from food. But this is why they're important. They protect you from free radical damage. And if you don't have enough antioxidants, then you can have a sort of runaway damage, and that's called oxidative stress. So oxidative stress can damage mitochondria. Within the mitochondria, one of the most important antioxidants is called coenzyme Q10. Now, the body can produce this by itself, but we also get a lot from the diet. So a deficiency of coenzyme Q10 can certainly be one of the causes of fatigue. So we'll return to this topic of oxidative stress later in the course when we look at detoxification. Next problem, you can have deficiencies of the cofactors needed. So I've already mentioned the B vitamins and magnesium, and iron is another one. So a lack of these can again create bottlenecks. I'll mention one last thing. The recycling of ATP and ADP across the membrane of the mitochondria can get slowed down, especially if the membrane has been damaged, for example, by toxins. Now, there are other causes of problems besides, but I'm not covering everything here. Let's return to another of the conditions that I listed earlier for the experience of vitality and energy: optimal delivery of oxygen to cells, and in particular to brain cells. Poor blood circulation in the brain, or poor brain perfusion, can be a consequence of some of the things that I'll talk about elsewhere in the course, but here I want to focus on breathing dysregulation. Breathing regulation is something that people tend to take for granted, and yet in my experience, poor breathing is one of the most common factors compromising brain function, and often to a significant degree. Moreover, it's an area where it's relatively easy to make significant gains through optimal breathing training. The main form of dysregulation is overbreathing or hyperventilation. Paradoxically, overbreathing leads to a reduction in the oxygen supply to brain cells. Most people think of hyperventilation with reference to panic attacks, but the key point here is that hyperventilation is a matter of degree. A panic attack is an extreme degree of overbreathing, where oxygen delivery to brain cells can be reduced by up to 60%. But much more common is mild overbreathing, where the reduction is 10, maybe 20%. In these cases, you don't normally recognize it as hyperventilation. In my experience of working with stress-related problems, dysregulated breathing is usually one factor. Maybe not the only factor, but especially in cases of anxiety. Let's talk about how overbreathing can cause problems. So breathing, as you know, is about taking in oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is essentially a waste product. But as I said earlier, carbon dioxide is not just a waste product. It has important functions, and particularly in the blood, where it controls the pH or acidity. And that's something that the body needs to keep in tight control of. So when you overbreathe, you actually reduce the amount of carbon dioxide dissolved in the blood, and that causes problems. Firstly, it causes blood vessels in the brain to constrict. And secondly, the blood holds on more tightly to its oxygen. And both these factors combine to reduce oxygen delivery, especially to brain cells. It's worth adding that the brain actually regulates carbon dioxide rather than oxygen. That is, it monitors the level of CO2 as a basis for controlling breathing. If carbon dioxide builds up, then the brain automatically increases breathing. Now, in a classic panic attack, you can get a situation where, because of overbreathing, blood carbon dioxide drops, but in the brain tissue, it builds up because the oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange isn't happening, leading to the experience of air hunger. And then the brain tells the body to breathe even more, and so it creates a vicious cycle of worsening hyperventilation. Again, a panic attack is quite an extreme degree of hyperventilation, usually short-lived. But mild overbreathing is more common and can become habitual. When that happens, the body makes adjustments that can lead to problems that you wouldn't normally connect to breathing, such as low mood, fatigue, and brain fog. In my office, I regularly assess breathing using a device called a capnometer. It measures carbon dioxide in exhaled air, and it's the best way to detect overbreathing. Not only that, but the same device can be used for biofeedback, that is, as a tool for training breathing, and thereby learning to optimize oxygen delivery to the brain. It's one of my favorite tools because I know it can often deliver profound benefits. Let's return to the topic of fat burning. Important if, like so many people, you want to lose some weight. Brain cells normally burn the sugar glucose for fuel, but they can also burn, as an alternative, something called ketone bodies, which are derived from fat. And when the brain is burning these ketone bodies, that's called ketosis. And a lot of people are reporting that being in ketosis feels very good, They feel clear and focused and energized, as though the brain is working much more efficiently. People suffering from epilepsy have found that staying in ketosis reduces seizures. So how do you access this state of ketosis? Well, basically you have to run out of glucose, and that means not eating carbohydrates and for long enough to exhaust your body's stored carbohydrate, and that's called glycogen. So there's something called the ketogenic diet, which is basically a diet of almost zero carbohydrates. And it induces ketosis, and it became popular as a treatment for epilepsy. Now, there are some potential pitfalls for a zero-carb diet, so I wouldn't recommend it for most people. But it might be something to consider if you have a severe blood sugar regulation issue, and we'll discuss that in the next unit, blood sugar regulation. But there is a sort of cheap way to experience this state, and that is to consume something called Mct oil, which is actually an extract of coconut fat. Mct oil is a type of fat that's very easy to convert into ketone bodies, and particularly if you have the most refined extract. So the brain can start using ketone bodies even in preference to glucose. And people report that taking Mct oil shifts them into a state of heightened clarity, focus and energy, if only for a relatively short period. But even so, it might be a useful thing to consider, or just a useful thing to have around as an option for times when you need to access peak performance. So we've talked about some of the possible bottlenecks in energy production and causes of fatigue and associated problems. So now we'll take a look at the testing options. Well, the first thing to say, and probably the most important thing, is that if you have a relatively mild fatigue, that is, you're basically functioning and you can just about hold down a job, for instance, then you probably want to start looking elsewhere or testing elsewhere. That is, not cellular energy production, but to look at things like blood sugar control and hormonal regulation of energy. Problems here are much more common. In these cases, energy tends to be more variable. So your energy can crash, but it can recover fairly quickly, or in something like an hour or two or a few hours. But if you have crashes that last for days and are to the point that you can hardly even get out of bed, then you may well have mitochondrial damage. And if that's the case, then there are specialized tests looking at mitochondrial function. But I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I'll just mention a few of the simpler options. So you can test for oxidative stress. You can look at lipid peroxides. These are actually fat molecules that have been damaged by oxidative stress. So their level is a functional indicator of how well your antioxidant systems are coping. You can test glutathione, which is one of the body's main antioxidants. And another is coenzyme Q10, which I mentioned earlier on, as being the most important antioxidant inside of mitochondria. We'll finish the presentation by summarizing what we've covered. The foundation for the experience of vitality and energy is cellular energy production, or the controlled burning of fuels from food in the presence of oxygen, releasing energy that's captured as ATP. There are multiple possible causes for fatigue. Even within the cellular energy production system, there are multiple steps, each of which is a possible bottleneck. And we've looked at some of those, and particularly in the functioning of mitochondria, the engines of the cells. But for the sort of problems that we're focusing on, that is mild fatigue, anxiety, mood problems, low motivation, brain fog, it makes more sense to start looking elsewhere at the regulation of energy production, for example, the regulation of the fuel supply. And in the next unit, we'll take a closer look at that.